Architecture Codex. If you want to see more, like, comment, share, and most importantly, subscribe.
One of the biases of Architecture Codex is that it reflects the buildings and places that I have encountered. So you know, at some point I was going to get to my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. But I am not going to talk about the football stadium, the domed administration building, or even Touchdown Jesus. Instead, I am going to talk about the recently completed new School of Architecture in a style which is a glaring departure from the predominantly Hoosier Gothic campus and from the modern architecture movement in general. The Walsh Family Hall School of Architecture was completed in 2019 and designed by renowned traditionalist architect John Simpson of Great Britain. It fits in with his style of being heavily neoclassical, shunning the modern styles promulgated by the Bauhaus-influenced architecture schools like IIT, Yale, and Harvard in the 20th century. To understand the building, one might need to understand the program of architecture at Notre Dame, as well as the campus in general. Notre Dame was founded in 1842 by Father Sorin of the Holy Cross Order based in France. It had one of the earliest schools of architecture, established in 1898, but it was hidden inside the School of Engineering for almost 100 years. I say hidden because most of the time when I would apply for a job and they asked, what school of architecture did you go to, I would say Notre Dame. And they would say, I didn't know Notre Dame had a school of architecture. And then they would ask me about the football team. Perhaps our most famous alumnus is John Bergey, who partnered with Philip Johnson for a time. Meanwhile, Notre Dame went about establishing itself as one of the premier Catholic colleges in the United States. In the last millennium, when I was a student at Notre Dame, things were less formal, less rigid. I recall our university chaplain, the Reverend Robert Griffin, aka Father Griff, commented that Notre Dame was run as if it was a hobby of the Holy Cross Order. And at our School of Architecture, we benefited from the arguments our professors would have in the open regarding modernism versus postmodernism, rationalism versus historical style, and practicality as opposed to theoretical application. I recall a trip our class took to IIT, the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago, which was once run by Mies van der Rohe, and I saw that all the students were doing lesser versions of Crown Hall, perhaps Mies's most enduring archetype. And I realized that they were fostering discipleship instead of fostering independent critical thinking. And discipleship is not the same thing as artistic and architectural creativity. And I realized that we were benefiting at Notre Dame from the cacophony of our program. At the time, though, Notre Dame's architecture school also had a full year in Rome, established in 1969 by the school chair and École des Beaux-Arts trained Frank Montana. This was a year-long study into architecture history with particular emphasis on Greco-Roman classicism from the ancient world through the Renaissance and into the Baroque period. So our school curriculum was unparalleled in the extent that we had a lot of traditional classical education in addition to all the modern architecture. During that year in Rome, I appreciated the dialogue between traditional Greco-Roman architecture and modernism. And to this end, I posted at my drafting station a quote from Le Corbusier, which stated, "Rome is the damnation of the half-educated. To send students of architecture to Rome is to cripple them for life." My professors did not appreciate the quote, nor do they appreciate my overall learning style. I have always questioned the status quo because I feel if it cannot withstand scrutiny, then it might just be pompous propaganda and not absolute truth. Status quo could be universal truths, but it might just be lazy complacency, going along to get along, while denying absolute truth. So when I question authority, I am willing to sit back and listen to a good answer if they have one. But when people erroneously call me a contrarian, I have to resist the urge to reply, "No, I'm not." Back then, there was no computer-aided design or building information modeling, which is how I spend most of my time these days. Instead, we spent a lot of time drafting things by hand, using T-squares and triangles. And that year in Rome was also an opportunity to learn the traditional art of sketching and watercolor, as taught by Professor Montana himself. Professor Montana was not threatened by my method of questioning, and I learned a lot from him. And he even encouraged me to stay in architecture when the other professors in that year told me that I would never be an architect. And obviously, his guidance inspired me to start a collection of sketchbooks so that whenever I traveled, I would bring books with me to draw what I had seen. And it's from these sketchbooks I have drawn the inspiration for the Architecture Codex videos. The next year, we were back in Indiana. The Notre Dame campus, since the earliest days, was a beautifully planned campus with diverse buildings. We started as a log cabin, eventually built the French Renaissance domed administration building, and a Gothic basilica. But we also had neo-Gothic dorms, a classical library turned into our architecture building, and modernist dorms, and library, and other buildings. After I graduated, they even played with some postmodern buildings, mimicking the Gothic form, at least when silhouetted. Before it became a political slogan, you could say that the Notre Dame campus was quite diverse in its buildings, and even in the student body. I mean, you got to meet Catholics from all over the United States. Somewhere in the 1990s, the new powers at Notre Dame, whom Father Griff described as the yuppie priests, decided that Gothic was the true Catholic style, and therefore all the buildings needed to be collegiate Gothic. And they built a lot of them, and branded them Catholic with the pointed arch. Notre Dame upped its building game during this period and did a great job with nicely detailed buildings, but all limited to a pseudo-Gothic castle fortress style, even though the chances of an attack by Huns or Visigoths were remote. You could imagine drawbridges added to some of these buildings. Maybe it was symbolic of the Saturday morning fall conflicts, and the buildings were protection from invasions by Seminoles or Wolverines. In 1989, Thomas Gordon Smith became the new chair of the architecture program, and he unabashedly shifted to a strictly classical education. Coincidentally, he and I were being mentally crippled, studying in Rome during the same year as he had won the Rome Prize Fellowship. He believed that classical Greco-Roman architecture was the purest form and, ironically, the most Catholic form of architecture. His first step was to remove the School of Architecture from the College of Engineering, which subtly sent the message that technical proficiency was less important than style. Cranky old man. There would now be a school of thought at the architecture school at Notre Dame. To emerging curmudgeons like myself, this was not a good thing. This would be like saying I'm a philosophy major, but I will only study the Greek naturalists. By the way, the Greek naturalists were the source of the architectural aesthetics that created the Greco-Roman style of architecture. You could read about that in my book, Architecture of the Body, Soul, and Mind, which links the philosophies with the architectural styles. It's a bit of a plug. I'll get back to the subject at hand. I think the declaration that there is only one good style of architecture is a seriously flawed concept. As good as Greco-Roman architecture is, are you helping students by telling them that this is the only acceptable form of architecture? I did not like it when modernism declared it as being the supreme form of architecture and ignored and obliterated all of history. I guess I don't like it when any authority tells me what art and architecture should look like. Perhaps I am a contrarian. Cranky old man. The biggest advantage to this change is that the curriculum does pay attention to classical architecture, which has been too long ignored by other architecture schools. And it has put the Notre Dame School of Architecture on the map. Another attribute to this change is that the school emphasizes hand drawing and watercolors, a skill which was once an architect's by default, but with computers can be too easily sidestepped. They do get into computers the last 2 years of their study, which is a good thing, because being able to paint watercolors is a really nice hobby to have while you're looking for a job. I suspect I just ruined any chance I had of ever being asked back to Notre Dame to talk about architecture. Back to the building. John Simpson is perhaps the classical architect of our age, so it was a natural thing for Notre Dame to engage him to design the building. By putting the new building on the extreme south edge of the campus, it is far enough away from other buildings that Notre Dame's leadership can tolerate it not being collegiate Gothic. In fact, a new neoclassical museum is being built south of it by the other classical architects of our age, Robert Stern's Ramsar Group, Architectural Codex number 33. So it seems the university will accept a pagan, non-Catholic, Greco-Roman corner on their campus. The building amply expresses the isolation, geographically and stylistically, of the architecture students from the rest of the campus. Architecture students are already isolated from much of the Notre Dame student body simply because they spend so much time in their studio. And with the year in Rome and with the professional degree being a 5-year program, they're never really sure which is their graduating class. As a result, their experience relies more heavily upon the 50 or so classmates in their architecture school than on anything else. Walking in and around the Walsh family building, one might get a sense that it suffers from multiple personalities. It is not a single Greco-Roman building rendered in a single neoclassical style from a single era. It is not purely Imperial Rome. It is not purely High Renaissance. No one really knows why it has a lighthouse, as the school is not near any body of water. Perhaps it is a lookout to warn young architects of a mid-century modern edifice being built in neighboring South Bend. But maybe it is a testament to the core architectural philosophy, which is about style, not function. Function is what you fit between the columns of the stoa. Cranky old man. The building is really a bunch of building parts melded together, and I mean that as a compliment. The building achieves its mission and therefore should be considered a success. It gives young architects a practical lesson in the many different ages of classical architecture. If you want to see the Greek column orders, they are there. If you want to see Romanesque brick arches, they are there. If you want to examine details of a Baroque stair, they are there. The Walsh Family Hall School of Architecture at Notre Dame proudly boasts the school's aspiration. We teach both kinds of architecture, Greco and Roman. I'm Michael Molinelli, and this is Architecture Codex.